Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Spy at the Highland Court by Celeste Barclay. Narrated by Paul Woodson. Chapter 1. Dedric Hartley watched as the English king continued his royal rage as courtiers and advisers eased away from their irate sovereign. His Majesty's face was mottled with red splotches that only accentuated his fair complexion, and spittle formed at the corners of his mouth as his rant amplified. King Edward stalked about the chamber on the long legs that earned him the moniker Longshanks. "I don't give a bloody damn who oversaw the attack. It failed." He railed against the last adviser who tried to reassure him that the recent loss wasn't the end of his campaign against the Scots. "Failure is failure. That usurper believes he's got the upper hand, and he will continue worming his way further into England now that he thinks he has outsmarted me. I should have killed him when I had the chance." King Edward muttered his final comments as he sank back into the engraved and carved chair that sat on a dais. His bile spewed. The king retreated into his own thoughts as the rest of the chamber was left, wondering what to do next. Dedric had seen this pattern countless times over the course of his life. He was all too familiar with the king's mercurial temper and unpredictable outbursts. But he also knew Edward was one of the best strategists and logisticians to have ever lived. While he might not like the man, he respected him, at times. Rick watched as the king scanned the crowd, assessing each knight present until his eyes settled on Rick, who wished he could melt into the curtains and watch the people in the gardens below. "Sir Dedric, approach." Rick stifled his groan, knowing from experience that the king would construe even the slightest hesitation as a personal, punishable offence. Rick approached the dais and bent into a low bow, awaiting the slight flick of Edward's fingers that would indicate he could rise. He knew it was the king's intention to make him wait. When the signal finally came, Rick stood to his full height with his shoulders back and spine straight, just as had been hammered into him since the days when he was a page in the royal household. "You were there." It was more an accusation than an observation. "What the hell went wrong?" Dedric didn't shift or squirm like he wanted, and he didn't avert his gaze. Instead he weighed his words and chose them judiciously. "There were simply more of them than us." Rick didn't miss the collective gasp that his curt answer elicited. He waited for the king to explode again, but this time Edward laughed. It was a hearty laugh, but Rick didn't miss the lack of mirth in the king's eyes. "So, it was as simple as that. How did I not realize?" Edward stood once more and left the dais, this time placing himself directly in front of Rick. "Sir Dedric, since I'd already deduced the insufficient numbers on our side, I had hoped you might have more insight than to state the obvious." What started as a reasonable tone ended in a bellow. "Your Majesty, the clans put aside their enmity toward one another, not just neighbours, but Highlanders and Lowlanders, and showed up in great force. There was a great conviction to defeat us, and not just for their land." "Ah, yes, the great Scottish pride. The same pride I have spent a lifetime hammering out of them." Edward sized up Rick, and Rick knew whatever came next would be something he would dread. "You're a Scot." The king paused, purposely, to silently encourage the whispers that spread through the chamber, grimacing when Rick didn't blink. Edward had hoped to garner some reaction from the knight standing before him, but he had underestimated what Dedric Hartley had learnt over a lifetime of serving the English king. "Half, Your Majesty. I'm a Hartley." The name of the well-respected English family made many in the chamber take notice, but the king's mention of his Scottish heritage was a stigma Rick could never get past. "Yes, and like your father, Hallam, you are one of my best knights. You have been part of my household since I took you in as a page. I just hope you don't make the same mistake as your father and go falling in love with a Scot, then getting yourself killed. I'm not raising any more half-Hartleys." The alliteration garnered the snickers Edward wanted. Dedric had heard the phrase countless times over the 20-plus years he had been in the king's service. His father had been the illustrious Hallam Hartley, a knight in the king's service sent to the border to wage war against the MacLellan and Maxwell clans. Hallam ended up falling in love with Emelote MacLellan. They married and were content to make a life for themselves with her people, but a former friend who never accepted Hallam's decision to side with the Scots was his betrayer. Hallam and Emelote's marriage only lasted 6 years, ending abruptly when the English killed Hallam in a border skirmish. Dedric had few memories of his father, but he clung tightly to them. They had driven him his entire life, earning him the title of a knight. When Dedric was 7, the English, led by his father's former friend, raided and burnt their home. The man assaulted Emelote before murdering her and dragging Rick to King Edward. They forced him to become a page, and by the time he became a squire at age 14, he was sure Edward ordered the attack to ensure they took him from his mother. He was payment for the wrong Edward believed his father committed. His mother was retribution. The king hadn't taken him in, but rather stolen him, and he hadn't raised him, but intimidated him. Rick remained silent, not having missed the real meaning of the king's words. He was being sent back to Scotland when he had only just returned a week earlier. He was still tired, not to mention battered and bruised, from the last campaign. He had hoped for a longer reprieve, mostly so he could soak in countless hot baths before riding his horse again. "Which men would you have me lead, sire?" "Not men, just you, and I suppose your squire. You shall make use of that MacLellan blood, and be of greater use to me." Rick's stomach dropped to his boots. He had seen none of his mother's people since he was a child. He knew next to nothing about them other than they lived along the border. His missions had been to the eastern border, while the MacLellans' land lay to the west near the Stuarts, Maxwells, and Dunbars. He knew marginally more about his father, but his life and death were stories best kept far from King Edward's ears. As a 9-year-old, he had once gone nearly a week on bread and water for asking one too many questions about his parents. The king had banished Rick to a storage room, where he sat in the dark and feared they would never release him. He learnt then that Longshanks had a sadistic and vengeful streak. It had been at the Queen's mercy that the king forgave and reinstated Rick as a page. Queen Eleanor had taken pity on the orphan, having lost several of her own children. She used her influence on her husband to ensure Dedric received the tutelage he needed to become first a squire, then a knight. Dedric appreciated that Eleanor had the ability to tame her belligerent husband, from a roaring bear to a docile lapdog. So great was their love. The king's ongoing monologue brought Rick back to the present, and he caught the last of the king's orders. "You leave in the morning for the Bruce's court. You had better not fail me. I will rely upon the information you send back to destroy these heathenous Scots." The king clapped his hand on Rick's shoulder and gave it a squeeze. There was an element of pride in the king's eyes that made Rick wonder if Edward saw more to him than he revealed in public. "Aye, sire, I won't fail you." Rick wound his way through the corridors and passageways until he came to the knight's quarters. He had no intention of being seen again before morning. He would summon his squire, order a bath, and soak until goosebumps drove him from the tub into bed. He also intended to have his squire pack their belongings and squirrel away any food the kitchens could spare. Rick wasn't as tall as the king, but he stood over 6 feet and was a large man. His squire was a youth of 17, who still seemed to be made up of hollow arms and legs. They both ate a significant amount, and the supplies given to a travelling knight would barely last them the first 2 days. "The king seems to favour you after all." The honeyed voice made the hairs on the back of Rick's neck stand up. He knew who it belonged to, and he longed to bolt in the opposite direction from its owner. "Good eve, Lady Bella." Rick dipped his head, but continued on. "We have much to plan for. We should refresh our memories on how well we suit one another." Rick came to a halt as he looked down at the stunning woman he had made the mistake of bedding several times shortly after receiving his spurs. He hadn't even turned 21 and was still in awe that he had earned the title of a knight. The woman had appeared out of nowhere and filled his head with compliments and flirtation. As a landless orphan, he was unprepared for such an enticing woman to take an interest in him. Lady Bella had flattered him all the way into her bed. It was only after a month of sneaking off with her that he learned she was sneaking off with several other men and didn't share his feelings. Feelings he understood now had been puppy love and infatuation, but realizing she would never marry him was enough to teach him to keep all women at arm's length. He also knew that Lady Arabella Fitz-Bigod answered to Bella because she believed her looks warranted her being called beautiful as her name, not just as a descriptor. Lady Bella was the illegitimate daughter of a courtier, and King Edward often used her to seduce men into telling their secrets. Rick wasn't interested, and he had no secrets to tell. "I see the king didn't inform you that I'll be your go-between. You'll give your messages to me, and I'll ensure they make it to the king." "Thank you for bringing that to my attention." Rick tried to step past her, but Bella pressed her body against his. He leaned away, refusing the temptation after being celibate for the past several months while entrenched in battles against the Scots. He didn't trust his body to cooperate with his mind. Bella knew that and pressed more firmly against him, her hand trailing over his chest to his waist and then reaching even further down. His body reacted just as she wanted, and she purred as she stroked his arousal. "I can tell you remember. Travelling together will be entertaining." Bella pressed harder against Rick, and she tempted him to give in to her clear invitation. However, her words that they would travel together was the final bucket of cold water he needed. It irritated him to learn that he would have to rely on her for this mission, but to travel with her was unacceptable. He knew he would make a swift change in plans. "If memory serves me as well as you believe, I recall you're currently tied to both the Earl of Salisbury and the Earl of Essex, not to mention the Earls of Hertford and Lancaster. I'm sure you haven't time." He grasped her wrist and pulled it from his hardened cock, stifling the groan as his body rejected his sense of honor, preferring the release he knew she offered. Bella wasn't easily deterred, and once again leaned forward, offering him a view of the top of her nipples and the supple flesh of her breasts. Rick looked over her head and spotted his squire, Robbie, standing in front of his chamber. "You would do well to remember those names, since your future rests in the messages the king receives and who delivers them," Bella warned. Rick didn't look at her as he nodded once more and stepped around her at last. He made his way to his chamber without looking back. He opened the door and pushed his squire inside. "Begin packing. We leave during the evening meal. I intend to be far from this country by the time the sun rises." "Lady Bella seemed pleased to see you," Robbie mused. "You shouldn't have been looking." Rick chastised his squire, but there was no bite to his words. "She's rather hard to miss." Rick thought of something else that was hard. "Precisely. That is why we are riding out tonight, rather than in the morning. If we wait, we won't be able to miss her." "Where to, my lord?" "Scotland." Robbie's unimpressed smirk ended abruptly when Rick clarified. "Robert the Bruce's court." Chapter 2. It took 3 days for Dedric and Robbie to reach the Scottish border, but rather than cross into Kerr territory, they kept off the main roads and paths while they travelled another day and a half to MacLellan lands. The rolling hills and vistas of Cumberland and Northumberland impressed Rick, and the landscape continued into the southern uplands across the border. Rick considered the north a wild and beautiful place, and as a young knight he had hoped to one day earn a piece of land in the northern counties. He had survived more than one frigid and blustery winter there, but the other seasons made up for it. As they travelled further west, approaching his mother's clan's territory, his heart felt at home. It was an inexplicable and irrational emotion, but a peace of mind and body settled over him. He had never felt it to this extent along other parts of the border, or even in the heart of the English north. The land wasn't drastically different from one side of the border to the other, but he realized that he was returning to the place of his birth and his family. That created this longing. Robbie rode in silence, and Rick was grateful that the squire had learnt early in his service to curb his natural penchant for chatter. Rick appreciated the young man's company, and Robbie impressed him with his innate abilities with horses in and near battle. The more agitated other horses became before battle, the calmer those Robbie managed remained. He possessed insight into the people they travelled and camped with, and Rick knew he had remained alive more than once due to the information Robbie squirreled away to him. "I believe we're near to Kirkcudbright, where the laird's family lives. We should come to it before the River Dee." "Have you decided what you shall say when we arrive?" Robbie asked. "You don't sound very Scottish, and I certainly don't." "I have. Anyone who knows my story will know the English took me as a child. I was angry for most of my childhood, and most of the time I spent as a squire. Becoming a knight forced me to let it go, or I wouldn't have survived the first fight along the border. But that anger is still within me. I'll tell them King Edward released me from his service once my tenure came to an end, and I've come home. I'll tell them the truth. I never wanted to be there. I'll let a little of that anger show, and it shouldn't take much to convince them I'm telling the truth." "And you brought an English squire?" "You're in my service until I deem you ready to earn your spurs, at which time you must return to serve the king if you don't wish to remain with me. That's true enough." What the two men would leave out was that Robbie was the son of the Earl of Northumberland and second in line to inherit the title. There was little chance that Robbie would remain with Rick once he was knighted. Another hour passed as they plodded along, in no hurry to reach their destination. Rick knew that for his squire the willingness to trot rather than canter or gallop was apprehension, but Rick wanted to enjoy this sense of peace before diving into the lies that would consume him for the foreseeable future. The sun was inching toward the western horizon when they reined in and looked at the MacLellan keep. The stone structure was impressive and sat on a rise near the shore of the River Dee. The well-fortified Bailey wall stood higher than any needed in England. It was proof that the ongoing strife required a castle built for battle. The village that lay beyond the keep was larger than most, and there was activity as people moved about and smoke rose from rooftops. "I'm sure they've seen us, so we would do well to arrive on our own, rather than with an escort." Rick nodded toward the men that were small blurs along the battlements. They spurred their horses and approached the village, then the keep. "Who goes?" came the demand once they were within earshot. "Dedric Hartley, son of Hallam Hartley and Emelote MacLellan Hartley, second cousin to the laird." Rick sat as he heard voices, but the words were unintelligible. He tried to keep his nervousness from transferring to his horse. He wouldn't give away his mood with a horse that danced about. It wasn't long before the portcullis opened wide enough for 5 men to stand beneath it. The man in the centre was the laird, and his guard didn't look welcoming. "There is no Dedric Hartley in the MacLellan clan," the laird, Malcolm MacLellan, announced. Dedric heard the man speak, but he was struck with a vivid memory as he peered into the bailey. He raised his arm and pointed just to the right of the laird. "There. To your left once stood the armoury. It was too close to the gate, and when the English raided, they stormed the armoury and gathered the weapons before the laird's men could arm themselves. It was the reason they were able to kill so many, including my mother. Rick looked up and remembered a woman who stood in the window of a third-story chamber, waving at him as he played. The second window from the far end was my mother's chamber growing up, and it became my parents' until my father died. I had a trundle bed with a horse carved into the head. Memories flooded back as Rick swept his eyes over the castle and the surrounding buildings. He hadn't seen the place since he was 7, but it was as though he were a little boy again, playing in the corner near the kitchens. Aileen was the cook, and she would slip me apricot tarts while I played with the other children. She made me share with my cousin. Rick looked at the man more closely. You. The final word came out closer to a whisper. Both men sized one another up before the laird nodded. Some of that you could have learnt from anyone who heard of the raid 20 years ago, but you couldn't have known about the trundle bed my own son sleeps in, nor would you have known about the pies. Even with the acknowledgment that they were family, there was no invitation to enter the castle. Why are you here? It's been a long time, and we heard that you served the English bastard. I did. Rick would get that admission out of the way from the beginning. He had me stolen. He believed my father owed him my service after choosing my mother over him. They raised me at court before I earned my way to being a knight. My service is now through, and I don't wish to remain fighting for the man who killed both of my parents. Rick knew there would never be a confession from the king that he arranged the 2 battles that killed first his father, then his mother. But he was certain Edward knew, and condoned it. After all, it was Longshank's order to fight along the border. The laird continued to assess Rick before he stepped aside and turned his back to Rick and Robbie, but not before he gave the signal for the guards to raise the portcullis all the way. Rick nudged his horse, and Robbie followed. They entered the bailey, and Rick felt awash with more memories. Memories raced before his eyes. Memories of his early childhood that he hadn't thought about since he became a squire and forced himself to only look forward. Rick and Robbie handed their reins over to a stable boy and dismounted. As they did, a woman came to stand at the top of the steps, and it was clear she was the laird's mother. The sun shone in Rick's eyes, but as he approached the laird who now stood below his mother, Rick's step faltered. He felt the blood leach from his face, and he was sure he was looking at a ghost. He shook his head before taking a step back. "We could have been twins," came the woman's soft voice. She moved down the steps until she could pass her son, who put his arm up to block her advance. She gently pushed it away. "As much as I looked like your mother, you're the image of your father." The woman stopped in front of Rick and took his large, rough hands in her tiny, smooth ones. "I'm your mother's cousin, Emmeline." Emmeline and Emmeload. I still have the scar on my knee you stitched when Malcolm and I jumped from the rocks into the river. You promised to fix it before we showed my mother. Rick swallowed several times as he watched his aunt's smile broaden, and she pulled him into her embrace. It had been years since the Queen had embraced him, and the motherly comfort was too much for him. When Emmeline pulled away, she cupped his cheek with one hand and placed the other over his heart. "You won't have a warm welcome here, but anyone who's old enough to remember my son as a child will know who you are on sight," she murmured for only Rick to hear. She wound her arm through his and turned back to her son. When she stepped forward, Rick had no choice but to follow. Emmeline reached her other hand to Malcolm. The 3 walked into the great hall and toward the dais. Rick felt the eyes staring at him, judging him, and finding him wanting. He swept his eyes around the large chamber, taking in the swords above the fireplace and the heraldic shield that sat over them. The tapestries swayed from the breeze of the main door opening and closing. Rick paused before one depicting a knight on horseback, leaning over to grasp a woman's arm in preparation to pull her onto the horse. They were in a meadow filled with bright flowers and a beaming sun. Rick looked closer and saw that a child rode in front of the man. "Your mother made that in honor of your father's life. She hadn't finished before the raid, so my mother finished it and hung it in a place of honor." Those were the first words the laird spoke to Rick after admitting that they were indeed family. "I was raised on stories of your parents' great love. It rivaled that of my own parents." Rick could only nod as he took in the scene of his family memorialized upon the wall. He had never seen an image of his father before, and he understood why Emmeline said he resembled his father. It was like looking at himself on the wall. He knew he couldn't remain gawking at the tapestry now that Emmeline and Malcolm sat on the dais, along with a woman noticeably with child. Malcolm rested a protective arm round her shoulders as she leaned into him. Rick approached the dais and bowed to the woman, who was clearly the lady of the keep and Malcolm's wife. He stepped on to the dais and took the seat to the laird's right, between Malcolm and Emmeline. It surprised him that was the seat they showed him, but he supposed it was so Malcolm could drill him with questions. "You must have travelled a long way to reach us, unless you already had business along the border." Malcolm's tone didn't hide his distaste, and his implication that Rick had been fighting along the border was near to the truth. "I was with the royal court in Yorkshire when the day of my tenure ended. I departed that evening and rode here." "You're familiar with this land, but we've never seen you before." Malcolm referred to the other English troops that had harried the MacLellan clan, along with their other western border neighbours. "I haven't been this far west since I was 7. "So you've been to the east?" Malcolm continued to press. "Yes." Rick offered nothing more. He looked Malcolm squarely in the eye before taking a long draw from the chalice placed before him. Even over the rim, Rick continued to meet his cousin's gaze. "Malcolm," the woman, who still went without a name, whispered. The laird looked down at his wife's pleading face. "Not in front of your mother." Malcolm nodded but looked back at Rick, and it was clear the conversation had only been paused. However, Emmeline wasn't so willing to wait. "You fought along the eastern border. I take it you fought the Kerrs and Elliots." Emmeline's words were plain and without rancour, even though they made Rick uncomfortable. "When the king ordered me there." Malcolm couldn't hold back. "Ordered to fight your own people. I was sworn in fealty to the king. He may be the reason my parents are dead, but like it or not he housed me, fed me and clothed me, not to mention educated me when I became an orphan. I had a duty to repay that, and so I swore my oath. If I hadn't followed the orders, what type of honour would I have had?" Rick's voice was soft, but the iron was there. He wouldn't have his cousin intimidate him or mock him. If his time among his mother's people was short, then Rick would move on to Robert the Bruce's court. But the mention of oaths given and honour placated Malcolm. It was something the man could understand. The two warriors came to a truce of sorts, and Emmeline drove the rest of the conversation, finally introducing Malcolm's wife as Lady Rosalind. That afternoon, Emmeline took Rick on a tour of the castle and its grounds while Rosalind rested, and Malcolm handled clan affairs in his solar. Rick was only too glad to escape to his chamber before the evening meal for a bath and fresh clothing. "It seems your family welcomes you, if not with open arms, then at least not with a sword in your belly," Robbie mused as he laid out Rick's fresh surcoat and leggings. Once Rick shed his travel-stained clothes and stepped into the tub, Robbie sat with his back turned as he polished the knight's boots. It was odd, to say the least, to walk about the place. I hadn't thought of it in years. More faded memories came back to me. I could remember doing things better than I could people's names and faces. There were many in the Bailey who remembered my parents, and my resemblance to my father is uncanny, or so it seems. A few welcomed me in his memory, but most were standoffish, knowing that I served their enemy and fought their people. Rick submerged his entire body and held his breath as the hot water washed over him. For a moment, He felt like he would float away, but the tub was far too small for that. When he surfaced, he drew a bar of soap over a linen cloth and scrubbed his body before attending to his hair. He signaled for Robbie to pour the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?